relatively new section that was founded by a number of very prominent professors, not the least of which was the late Professor Deborah Rohde of Stanford Law School. We are doing several webinars this year focused on different aspects of teaching leadership. And I couldn't be more pleased that the very first webinar we're doing is with the chair-elect of this section, Professor Joan Hemenway. Let me go over a little logistics before I introduce Joan. Because this is in webinar format, we ask you to ask your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also use the chat function to just make a point or to talk to each other. But I want to make it clear that if you actually have a question that you would like me to ask Joan or her special guest, Beth Ford, you should use the Q&A. But the chat is something that is for everybody to basically to watch or to listen to what you have to say to each other. But the Q&A is for me to ask the questions. So having said all that, we're going to go to at least 1 o'clock. We might go a little past, depending on how this goes. Let me give you a brief introduction of Joan Hemenway, who's the Rick Rose Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Tennessee College of Law. We sent you a pretty extensive bio, and I know Joan would be upset with me if I read the whole thing, so I'm not going to. But she is quite well known in the world, not only of leadership, but also of corporate practice. She literally brought 15 years of corporate practice experience at a small mom and pop firm you might have heard of called Skadden Arps. And she spent 15 years there before joining the University of Tennessee College of Law. She has a national reputation in this area of disclosure regulation and policy under with federal securities, merger and acquisitions, you name it. She's an expert in it. And most recently, she has done some work in crowdfunding and done a series of articles relating to insider trading and criminal securities. But we're not going to talk about any of that today, despite the fact she could talk about that for hours. Instead, we're going to talk about leadership because she also is a leader in that field. And as I said, chair-elect of this section. So with that, I throw it to our moderator and panelist to introduce her fellow panelist, Joan Hemenway. Thanks, Joan.
Oh, thank you so much, Lee. That's such a generous introduction. I hardly deserve any of that, but my preference, of course, is, as Lee indicated, is to not have a long introduction. So I'm actually going to give Beth maybe a lighter introduction than Lee's introduction of me, but I'm delighted to be here today with my colleague, Beth Ford. She has been a friend of mine for a good long time, but has only recently become a colleague of mine at the UT College of Law on a more permanent basis. She's taught with us for an adjunct for many years. She's the current interim director of our Institute for Professional Leadership, and her background is in criminal law. She was our federal public defender in Knoxville, and I'm sure she will bring a lot of that to the conversation today. We thought the way that we might work this is to show you a set of slides and then allow for some time at the end for folks to ask questions. And I told Beth I would start off by just saying a word about how we came to the topic for today's webinar, Teaching Law Leadership with Non-Law Texts. And it actually has to do with the section on leadership. We had a forum last year where we were chatting about something else. I can't even remember what the forum was. Maybe Lee does, but and people started chatting in the margin the titles to books and the authors of books that related to leadership or that related to things they were teaching in leadership classes. And it became this very exciting little sidebar conversation. At least it was exciting for me, and I think it was exciting for a few others as well. And so when Lee proposed that we start our webinar series again this year, I knew that that was going to be the topic that I'd like to present, and jumped right on board to do the first webinar. My original plan was for this to be something that I was a mere moderator of, and that two of my colleagues, Beth and a colleague, Nick McCall, with whom I taught last fall in our leadership curriculum, would be the main presenters. Unfortunately, as some of you know from the communications that Lee has made to the section, and if you're in the section, you would have gotten this. Nick passed away just a few weeks ago. And It was super unexpected. He was on a long sought after vacation with his family, and these things happen. And so Beth and I decided that we would forge on anyway, and really do this in large part in memory of Nick. I will be raising a number of books that Nick would have been able to talk about with much more passion than I could possibly muster today. But we wanted you to know that he's really with us. And if you get a sense from the pictures that we chose to put on this slide, he was not only an amazing leader in and of himself and an amazing lawyer, but he also had a great time. And he instructed in so many different ways, both in the bar. The lower right photo is a bar presentation he recently gave. Up above that is an Inns of Court presentation that he actually taped before he left on vacation. And we watched it just a few days before his passing, which was very poignant for a lot of us. And then the upper left one was one I made him send me when he went to the beach on vacation, because he wasn't very good at taking vacations, actually. In any event, we did want to dedicate this to Nick. And so, Beth, maybe you could get us started a little bit with some more comments on Nick, and then take us into our first book.
I will. So I don't feel very qualified to be doing this. My plan was to rely on Joan and Nick. Nick, as you can tell from Joan's comments, was he was a Renaissance man, and he was a friend to everyone whom he met. I had known Nick for probably 25 years or so. We were members of the same church, and then we became friends through our work. So hopefully I will do maybe half as well as Nick would have done today, but my heart is certainly heavy, but I feel inspired by the leadership work that Nick accomplished in his life. So I love reading. I have at times been a member of at least 3 book clubs. One that I had at work with the Federal Defender's Office, and we invited people from the law school. I'm a member of a church book group, and I'm a member of a book group of women who have all been leaders, a group that includes the former provost of the university, a former law clerk, and a variety of other backgrounds. So I love to see how books connect to whatever part of my life that I'm looking at. I started preparing for this presentation by seeing if anyone had put together any lists of books for use in law school courses, and I couldn't find any. I could find a list of books that were recommended for people to read before they started law school. I could find a list of books for people to read before they started the practice of law, but I didn't find any that were just squarely chosen for courses. So I hope that when we finish today, that you will at least have some ideas of how non-text can be used in courses, in a variety of courses, and that you might consider doing that in your own schools. So the first book that I want to talk about is one of my favorites. This is a book that is a very compelling story, and that could most likely be used in several doctrinal courses, as well as an introduction for first-year law students. This book is about several leaders. It is about 2 Black attorneys in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in the year 1905, who were leaders. It is about an attorney general who became a Supreme Court justice, Terry Sanford, who was a leader, and it is about the Supreme Court at that time. This is a story of the only time that the U.S. Supreme Court has actually held a trial, and they found a sheriff and many other people, and I'm not giving anything big away, in contempt of court for disregarding the orders of the Supreme Court. So this is a book that could be used in an ethics course. It could be used in evidence, and it could be used in any discussion of federalism. But I think that it would be very useful as a book to recommend that law students read before they start law school. I could foresee it being used then for discussions during orientation. So Joan, you and Nick taught a new leadership course last fall, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about it and the books that you used.
Yes, and I'm drawing heavily from my colleague Nick, who helped design the course with me. The course was entitled Small Group Communication for Lawyer Leaders. And it was originated largely because we were starting to see, not just Nick and myself, but I bet Beth was seeing this too, even though we didn't talk to her much about it. Practitioners were starting to see some unusual communication things happening with our students. I'd say unusual in that maybe I'm just, very old school, but I would never think of beginning a message to a senior person in my office with either hey or yo, and the latter maybe being, yeah, right. So, these were the kinds of things we were observing in messages. People were telling me that cover letters for jobs were not looking as formalistic. And one attorney said to me at one point, how can I offer a job where I'm going to have somebody writing lengthy contracts as much as 100 pages long if they can't proofread a one-page cover letter and a one-page resume for consistency as well as content? And that sort of hit me upside in the head, because I know our students are smart enough to do those jobs and they've got a great doctrinal and experiential background, but they were mis-signaling through their communications. So communication was key, but then the other was small group. And I started to realize that in other disciplines, in particular in the business law, in the business area outside the law school, and I teach in the professional MBA program at the University of Tennessee as well as the law school, that they were teaching communication. They were teaching small group communication because small groups are the unit that most people either do their business in. So in lawyers, if we think about a team that's working on litigation or transactions in a federal government office, like where Beth worked, or in a private law firm, like where I work, that's often a small group being more than a dyad, more than two people. And the magic high number is not so much as important as really the low number. But to be honest, if you get much beyond 10 or 15 people, it's probably looking something like a larger group, and the communication is more performative. So we educated ourselves first. And I think some of the books that we have today, although I'm sharing ones that you could assign chapters to students from, were ones that we used to read in designing the course. And obviously for anyone who's designed a course, that's from scratch. That's an exercise you just must engage in. So this first one is one that Nick selected for us, Creating Effective Groups. And in that particular resource, we assigned a number of short materials and excerpted from them for our class slides. In particular, what we wanted folks to realize here is that just bringing people together in a room does not necessarily make a group. But when you're assigned a task, there are phases and things that you might notice in a group. Some of you may have studied Tuckman's, forming, storming, norming. Well, this book has an alternative 4-step process for engaging in group activity and understanding the interactions between and among the people in the group. And so we largely use this to frame the course, but also to alert students to things that might happen in a small group context. The next book is actually one that I chose. I was looking for something that had exercises in it and that also had things specifically about communication in a small group. And I found the book chapters for this actually online initially, and then bought the hard copy book because again, I guess I'm old school, but Beth and I were talking the other day about the fact that hard copy books can sometimes be a little bit more efficient to move around in than book chapters and text online. So we use this to do things like to define what a small group is, and to talk about what communication looks like in a small group and how that might be different from speaking to a larger audience, and how it might be different from having a one-on-one interaction with folks. We did not assign every chapter in this book, but we did put some excerpts in our slides and assign short pieces for the students to read. And it was a very successful adventure. This book is updated frequently also, which I find to be a real benefit. And so they're taking into account things that they're seeing on an ongoing basis and adding them to the text, although keeping the chapters the same so that you can follow really where things are going. And then I guess moving to the next one, this is one of my favorites, and I've added this in. This was not assigned in our course, but is a background, and I use it in my teaching in almost all of my courses when we are talking about leading. And I do, and I know Beth does, teach within doctrinal courses and experiential courses, leadership interstitially with the primary subject matter of the course. This book actually was recommended for reading by our chancellor, Dondi Plowman, and she is a student of leadership. She actually has her PhD in management and was part of our management department way back before she came back to the campus to serve as our chancellor. And really what this book helps you to do is to navigate with students the two things that I think people find dissonant when they're working with each other, not just in small groups, but really in any context, which is their compassion, their personal care for people, and their assertiveness, or as she puts it in the book, their ability to challenge directly. And she says those two things are really the most important things to combine, and you'll figure out how to use your leadership type and your personality type to work in that space when you work with it. But you can be too compassionate and you can be too candid, right? So she sets up a quadrant in the first chapter and tells some interesting stories about her background as a leader in business. And through that, you're able to see that radical candor, which is that sweet spot where you're caring personally at the same time as you're challenging directly. It gets put into juxtaposition with, for example, if you care personally, but you don't challenge directly, you're silent, you leave things on the table that should have been discussed. She calls that ruinous empathy, and these terms are sort of fun because they're rather strident. If in fact you are the silent type, not saying anything, and you have very little personal compassion or personal care, then she classifies you as being someone who acts with manipulative insincerity. And if you challenge directly and you have very little compassion, then you're obnoxious aggression. I think we can all see how, and there's a website, by the way, where you can find that quadrant. It's what's sketched out on the cover, but the actual terms that I've used and what I've explained from the book is in the first chapter, but also online in a website that if you type in radical candor and Kim Scott, you'll find the book and the quadrant. It's, I think, a really wonderful book for every lawyer to read, not just every lawyer who teaches leadership. So I'll turn it back to you, I think, Beth, now for a bit.
Well, so what I read about this book made it sound like that old saying that many of our mothers probably told us over and over, the don't say anything nice, or don't say anything if you can't say something nice, that is not necessarily the path to follow.
Oh, it's totally true. In the first chapter, the story she tells has to do with her being overly compassionate with a colleague. So that's absolutely right. So
the next group of books, it was very hard to put together just examples of 3 books. We are all very aware of how lawyers do not have a very good track record when it comes to taking care of themselves. The statistics that I know that all of you have read over and over discuss how we drink too much. There's a lot of substance abuse. We're not getting enough sleep. And even starting with very young lawyers and law students, we are a very anxious group of people. And of course, this is very closely tied to Rule 1.1 of the model rules of professional responsibility, that really, in order to be competent, we need to take care of ourselves. And I would applaud the state of Vermont, which has specifically added emotional well-being and physical well-being as a part of their rule. So here are 3 examples of books that chapters could be pulled from, or that the whole book could be used in a leadership course that when you got to the section that everyone should discuss, and that is taking care of yourself and thriving. Well, I'll hold off that thought for just a minute. And if you read the energy book and you think that is something that might apply to people no matter what their age, I'll just tell you that there is a children's version of the energy book that, without consulting their parents, I gave my grandchildren for Easter. And then this is sort of connected to Joan's discussion of Ms. Scott leading with kindness, but it takes it off in a little bit different direction. These are 2 sections of 2 books that are used in our basic leadership course, Leading as Lawyers, that one of the founders of the Institute teaches here at the University of Tennessee. And just a little description from the course, about the course. It's designed to help students succeed as new entrants into the legal profession. So these 2 books are set out different ways to thrive. Colin Powell's book talks about kindness, but also talks about respect, that when you give respect, of course, you will receive respect in return. There are also many additional books that would that you could find to demonstrate these principles. And
I think, Beth, thinking about, I'm super glad that you picked those 2 books to talk about, because I personally started a meditation practice during the pandemic. And I found that the kindness factor in leadership has been one of my significant strengths. And I actually have not read the Desmond Tutu book. And so you're inspiring me to actually go back and
I can lend it to you.
The Colin Powell's book. That's great. I'll come upstairs and pick it up when I'm back in Knoxville again. So thank you. And it may seem like a contrast to then be moving from kindness to fierceness all in one slide. But actually, we use this book for something that can be useful in both in kindness and fierceness. This is a great book about oral communication. And one of the aspects of the course that Nick and I focused on, we did several different sessions, one on verbal communication, one on nonverbal communication, and one on written communication, and then filtered some of that through the whole course. And this was part of our day on verbal communication. But the chapter that we assigned from the book, or assigned pieces of from the book, was actually on remaining silent. And the power of remaining silent, something that I think is sometimes hard for a lot of students and lawyers. We want to have, and I'll come back to this in a minute with the next book, but we want to have the answer and we want to convey it. And especially, I think, students who are eager because they've done such a great job studying and preparing. And I'm thinking of clinical students. I'm thinking of students I've worked with in simulations, but I'm also just thinking of students you might call on in class, whether they are part of a system that you have of calling on people, or whether you're cold calling on folks. And there's a student, of course, always who's in the front row, with their hand up, shaking it back and forth, just wanting attention to be able to speak. And so we tried to illustrate in class and show through the pieces of Susan's book that we assigned really why it might be a good idea to hold back and listen, illustrating it with some examples from both of our practices. And I'm sure anyone on the webinar or watching this recording has experiences from their practice that they can bring to bear. And I think that's an important point about all of these books, about choosing them for your teaching and also for assigning them, is try to pick the books. I mean, these resonate with us because of our individual practice backgrounds, which are quite different. But pick books that resonate with you and that help you to tell the story that you want to tell, and that help you to tell it maybe in a better way or in a different way from the way that you would tell it, so that you can make those points forcefully in class. And this book has a lot of great stuff in it, but I thought I would just highlight today the piece that we used in our course. I recommend it again for all lawyers to read, as well as potentially use in a course where it might have some utility for you.
Joan, did that
And I
book,
think related.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Beth.
Does this book have some exercises for communicating?
Only to the extent that you would derive them from the text.
Okay.
But I have another one for you. So I'm glad you asked that question, where we have that aspect of the book. So Warren Berger's an author that's well known, I think, to a lot of people who do work in the leadership space. But I had never read this book, A More Beautiful Question, until Nick McCall recommended that I read it. And I found it as powerful as he did. He just came in one day when we were designing the course. He brought it in, he slammed it down on the table, and he said, this is partially what this course is about. We need to teach our students to ask a more beautiful question. And that starts with the concept of, again, not jumping right in, teaching a student to hold back maybe, and to understand that by asking a question, by being silent, in the last book, and then by asking a question, you can find out much more from a client or a colleague. You'll learn more information. It enables you to formulate a more sophisticated, nuanced response. It also lets the other person know that you care, to be listening, and then also to be inquiring, that you have a curiosity about what it is they're saying. And that can sometimes motivate the other person to work with you in a team. So we did assign the first chapter of this book, which is formative. It also has, many of these books have great first chapters with stories in it about people who've gone wrong by not asking, for example, a more beautiful question, and how they've gone wrong. And then the book plays out in the subsequent chapters examples of how you might be able to teach students. Really, it's not a teaching book, but teach students what lessons to learn from miscommunicating by not asking a question, or from communicating by asking a good question. It has examples of questions in it that you can ask. And we pointed out some of those to the students as well, and explored that a little bit in our class. By the way, the class was run as a 2-hour class over 7 weeks, a 1 credit hour class, just to back into that. And the way we ran it is to take the first hour or so of the class and in some way use the reading to leverage into additional knowledge. And then in the second half of the class, we went ahead and did exercises of various different kinds, or a single exercise in classes where we had something large planned. So the day that we did A More Beautiful Question, I think we did something, it was the same day that we did silence. And so we did something on nonverbal communication and working with that.
And the review that I read of this book, it sounds like that the 3 most important questions are why, what if, and how.
Absolutely. Yes, those are the core. And then they build from there in the chapters, adding to, what you would do in certain situations to add to those questioning words.
So the textbooks with which I'm familiar, Deborah Rohde's book and Leah Teague's book, talk about leaders for social change, leaders who are seekers of justice, and servant leaders. As a criminal defense lawyer, there is a question that I was asked over and over and over, and it was very often in the cocktail party setting, where people said, how can you represent those guilty people? And this book is a great collection of essays by well-known criminal defense lawyers who talk about what their response is to that question. They certainly give a lot of thought or a lot of meat for discussion for students, and could be used in a variety of courses. They could be used in the clinical set. This book could be used in the clinical setting. It could be used in adjudicatory criminal procedure. The articles or the essays could be assigned in criminal law. So this is, as far as I know, this is the biggest collection of essays by criminal defense lawyers that is out there. And, you know, when you think about books that star criminal defense lawyers, most people will only be able to come up with To Kill a Mockingbird. But this is one that, well, even some of the authors probably could be the subject of some discussion in a course. So there are just so many books and so little time. And these are two books that I'm just throwing in because I think that they are such important books. This is sort of the catch-all of, you could assign chapters of these books in such a variety of courses. You know, I know that you all are all familiar with the subject matter of each of these books. Gideon's Trumpet, how the right to counsel, the Sixth Amendment, evolved over the years, and then Love Wins, another book about social change and how the story of three couples made it to the United States Supreme Court. So that's just my.
And sorry, I'm going to interrupt here because there is and I know we're going to get to geography in a minute, in a sense, but one of the powerful things about assigning Love Wins in Tennessee is that one of the couples that was part of the proceedings were two folks that ended up both teaching at the University of Tennessee, and so we had sort of some homegrown interest, I think, in that particular book. But both of those books are fabulous books.
And one of their lawyers is a professor at the University of Memphis.
Yes.
So more change, not just social change.
That's right. Not just social change, but change. So some of you have heard me talk about this. This is my favorite topic, and I'm not going to monopolize the remaining minutes that we have to talk too much about why I think leading change is one of the key things that we can teach students in any course in law school. I like to say lately, regardless of where you think our country is going and where you think the world is going, I think the lawyers are going to be the ones who are going to be on the front lines and doing the good work. So I hope that a lot of you feel the same way. I've listed 4 books here that are all part of John Kotter's series. But if you look at, and I know Beth mentioned Leah's book, if you look at Don Polden's book, if you look at Deborah Rohde's books, if you look at really anyone's leadership textbooks, they're going to talk in part about leading change, not just for lawyers as leaders, but for just about everybody. And one of the reasons why I like John Kotter's books is that I find them very accessible for a large variety of audiences. I already mentioned I teach at the law school, I teach in the professional MBA program. I'm also starting to teach in the fall in our undergraduate program. I'm teaching honors students in a leadership research seminar, and then in another class that actually focuses on leading change and managing change. And so I've been going back over these books in the context of really all of the teaching that I do to remind myself of why I find them so good. The original book, Leading Change by John Kotter, has in it, as many of you may know, sort of an 8 steps toward leading change. And He gets a little hard line in that first book about it. You got to do all of them. You got to do them all in order, et cetera, et cetera. Other leadership books, pick pieces of that up and run with them. I think it's instructive for students to see a rubric of some kind if you're going to talk about leading change. And I've had to use this in the classroom in an article I wrote in the Santa Clara Law Review a few years ago, based on our leadership symposium that year that Don Polden hosted. I mentioned the story, but it has to do with a business law course where I was telling Beth the other day that the catalyst was a speaker didn't show up. All of a sudden you have to, at the last minute, figure out what you're going to do with that class. And I asked the students, I knew ahead of time, so it wasn't at the very last minute. I asked the students if they would take some of the material we've been dealing with and prepare a short presentation. It was a small section class for the class of, I think it was 5 minutes in length, or maybe 10 minutes in length for a 75-minute class. And then we discussed them, and it turned out 2 of the students chose diversity on boards of directors. It was an advanced business law course. And we got into a rather interesting discussion about that. And one of the students raised their hand near the end of class and said, so as a junior lawyer, though, in a law firm, how would I try and tell my client that they might want to make a change because having diversity on their board is powerful for a variety of reasons that are useful to them? How do I do that? Do I have to go to my supervisor and make that change and and ask that person to convey that change to the client? And so there was like 5 minutes of class left when that question was asked, which was a bigger question than I was prepared to answer in 5 minutes. And so I said, let's come back and talk about that in the next class. And I pulled out John Cotter's 8 steps, and we walked through them and talked about them and talked how even a junior lawyer in an office or a law firm scenario could maybe raise that kind of an issue and work it through both the law firm within the small group there, but also raise the issue in a useful and appropriate way with the client. So that's the formative book. And then The Heart of Change follows on with a lot more stories. So if you need stories in your teaching about change leadership, these are all business stories. Unlike Beth, I'm teaching mostly students who are dealing with either transactional or litigation or advisory or compliance work in the business law area. So those stories are really useful and helpful to me. And here's where I want to make the plug, Beth, for the question that you asked before. This is a workbook that comes with that book that I actually brought with me here in Kentucky, where I'm in a board meeting for the next few days. And so you can find, for some of the leadership books that are definitely used in teaching in other settings, some workbooks. And those workbooks can be extremely useful to your teaching. And I know there have been people who've written about using business case studies, for example, and how to use that technique in the classroom. But I figured I would at least show that. The most recent book in John Cotter's series is the Change book. That's the teal one that's on the right of the slide. And the one that's below is probably familiar to many of you who teach in this area. Our Iceberg is Melting. It's an allegory about penguins and how they solve the problem of the melting iceberg. And I won't give away more than that. It's very cute, but it's like the Energy Bus book that Beth was promoting earlier. It does have an appeal to many audiences. And I find this is a good one. I think I'm going to assign it, and I'll look for the wisdom of the crowd if you think I'm wrong, to my undergraduates in the fall to help them to see how working in a small group to lead change, because their research projects are on 3 grand challenges that Tennessee faces: K through 12 education, rural Tennessee, and drug addiction. And so they're going to be working in spaces where change is needed and where the president of the UT system has asked us all to focus a lot of attention. So there are more than 4 books in the series. Again, if you go to John Cotter's website, you can get all of them. There are reviews of most of them online, at least that I've found. But these are the 4 that I wanted to focus today in his series. He works with a research group. He's professor emeritus at Harvard and has been for a number of years, but he works with a research group that's actively engaged still with his change leadership sort of research agenda, if you will.
Well, I want to add to Joan's remark, or bringing to your attention the workbook. I found a very interesting workbook for leadership recently. It's called The Poetry of Leadership. And it's a journey into the leadership of self using poetry, and also has exercises. So if you have students who are have any interest in poetry, it's a real interesting book, and I think would be useful at least as an addition to a course, a extra credit maybe component. So our last slide, unfortunately, everyone doesn't take a leadership course. And so I think that we're faced with the challenge of how do we bring leadership, how do we teach leadership to an entire student body when they don't have the opportunity to take one of these courses that Joan has discussed. So here in Tennessee, we are somewhat proud of our storied basketball, women's basketball history. And we had an event the same week of the Final Four where we brought in a speaker who was a graduate of the UT College of Law. And she had filed a lawsuit in the mid-1970s against the governing body for high school sports in the state. She sued probably half of the state, but the issue before the court was whether or not it was discriminatory to not allow girls to play full court basketball. And it is a story that is filled like contempt of court with many leaders. These two young attorneys who filed the lawsuit were certainly leaders. The federal court judge who decided in their favor was a leader. The young woman who was 15 who agreed that this lawsuit would be brought on her behalf was a leader. So we had a lunch event where one of the attorneys came in and was interviewed by one of our leadership students. The attorney was also the founder of Law Women, the women's organization here at the College of Law. We gave away 15 copies of this book that was written by another UT alum and the daughter of two UT Law alums. And we gave it out the week before spring break with the hopes that they would spend part of their spring break reading this really fun little book. I gave them about 3 questions to consider as they read the book. And then the end of the week, after we had the attorney come in for our lunch event, Bill Haltom was a guest of the Knoxville Bar Association to discuss the book. So we co-sponsored with the Knoxville Bar Association an event and invited the students to attend it. So there are creative ways to bring students in and to encourage them to listen and to think about leadership, even if a big part of it is maybe they came because of the lunch, but they came, they had good questions, and I think that it's an event that should probably be repeated in the future.
I want to encourage those of you who are watching, if you want to use the Q&A, you can ask a question. I will take this moment and an opportunity to say that we have 2 people on the call who have written books, and they were both referred to by Joan and Beth. One is Leah Teague, and this is her book, Fundamentals of Lawyer Leadership. And the other is Don Colden, and this is his book, Leading in Law. So if you're an author, let me know, and maybe I've got my book your book right behind me, and I can show that on the screen too. And my guess is that everybody on this call could give us some additional books that they recommend. So even if you don't want to ask a question, you can use the chat function or Q&A so that we all can benefit by your recommendations as well. Joan and Beth, I throw it back to you to keep talking, but I will to let you know if there's any more questions.
I'm not sure that I have anything additional to add. I bet Joan does.
Oh, all I'll add is that we will supply Lee to you the slideshow because we know that even some members of the executive committee couldn't be here today. And it also, as a final slide, has
Oh, yeah.
the email addresses. Oh, that's okay. You don't have to bring it back up. The email addresses for both Beth and for me. Of course, we're, if you search for our names, if you remember our names, you should be able to find us on the UT Law website. If not, let us know because that would be a big glitch. But we did put them on there. And Lee, I'm hopeful that you can post the slides along with the recording link or that the ALS can do that for us. And we welcome people to contact us. And actually, I welcome personally people to contact us with some of those books you were suggesting that people put in the chat, because I think you can't read enough books in order to teach leadership, in whether it's in a doctrinal classroom, an experiential classroom, or in a classroom that's focused really solely or primarily on teaching leadership to law students.
April
So I think maybe we'll leave it at that.
Well, one thing I'll tell you that April Barton, who is the Dean of Duquesne Law School and also the immediate past chair of our section, just wrote a note that says that she often refers to Liz Wiseman's book, Multipliers. In fact, I've heard April talk about Liz Wiseman before, so that's an excellent one. I'll also take advantage of the fact that I'm got some leadership book behind me. Some of these are obvious ones, but this one I love by Doris Kearns, Leadership in Turbulent Times, because I love using stories, and those are wonderful stories. There's also
I have a signed copy of that one, Lee. I'm excited about that too.
That's impressive. This one is a workbook by Linda Gonzell, a PhD business professor, Joan, at the University of Chicago Business School, which is very, very good. This is a book by a very close friend of mine, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens. It's Richard Haas, the President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. I got just two more, I promise. This one is Lead Yourself First. This is Judge Raymond Kethledge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. And then finally, one that just came out recently, David Gergen, who has served with 5 different presidents, both Republican and Democrat, called Hearts Touched with Fire. And I'm guessing all of you could do the same thing. Here's a question. Is there pushback from students or other faculty members about non-law reading when you introduce the text of these books in your courses?
So that's a super question. I'm going to answer it in 2 ways. I mean, the general answer is no. And in large part, that has to do with the fact that we have a graduation requirement at the University of Tennessee College of Law that every student must take a course that is called a perspectives offering. And a perspectives offering must use some non-law material in the course. That can include something like antitrust, where economics is being brought in. It can include a management course where leadership is being brought in. And it can include, as another course, this is what I want to leverage into my second answer to the question. I taught a course I teach animals in the law also. It's like a little bit of an odd duck thing. And I won't bother to explain why here, but if you're interested, you can contact me and I'll let you know. And I taught it with a moral philosopher from our philosophy department, so that he could introduce moral philosophical views of animals that might be formative to either current law or law reform. And the students, we had half the students were political science and philosophy, social science folks, undergraduate and graduate, and half were law students, and that was by design. The non-law students loved the law material. They had a blast. They rated the course super highly. The law students really did not like the course. And what they did not like was the assigned reading in philosophy. They found it too dense, too many pages. It was a very different tradition of teaching and learning that my colleague was using. And even though those folks had all been undergraduates, and a lot of them had probably done social science work as undergraduates, they pushed back really hard. And so we determined if we were going to teach the class again, which we did not end up doing because he retired, that we would, and not because of the course, he didn't retire because of the course, I want to be clear. But we would have to reformulate the course and reconstruct the readings for law students. So part of it is knowing, you know, what your institutional objectives are, I guess, and part of it in terms of your colleagues and the administration, and part of it is knowing your students. And I learned a lot about my students by messing up in that course.
Here's another question. Can you please share a little bit more about the exercises you use at the second hour of your 2-hour class?
Yeah, and I'm happy to supply the syllabus to anyone. I know, Lee, you're on a campaign to collect syllabi for teaching leadership courses. So I'll promote that with everyone here who's on the call, and you can re-promote that if you want later. But on the first class, I should have the syllabus in front of me, but I don't. In the first class, we use, I forget what they're called, but they're these balls that they look like little soccer balls, but they've got, they're used in human resources. They've got little sayings on each thing. And this was part of our, you know, learning who your crowd is, who your group is. So you're in crowd and you're out crowd kind of thing, and what a small group is. We had them toss around this ball, and we flipped it. So they did this at the beginning of class after a brief introduction. You have to read the little piece of the ball, and then you have to answer. And you have to answer directly. You can't obfuscate, and it has to be a relatively quick answer. So we had them basically introduce themselves to each other by reading these little snippets and responding. And one of the students in the class, what he picked up was, what do you spend your money on when you have, you know, excess cash? And he said, I don't spend money. I don't spend money on myself, like maybe food, right? And people found this amazing, and it led to a lot of discussions over the 7 weeks of the course among people. They'd come back to that. So I thought that was a super useful icebreaker kind of tool that we used. But the one that I mentioned to Beth the other day that is particularly salient for me is when we were dealing with nonverbal communication and verbal communication. We had them do an exercise where they had to organize, they had to close their eyes, and we trusted them. We didn't put blindfolds on them. They had to organize themselves by height. And this was maybe 3 classes in or 4 classes in along the side of the room. And so we put them all there so they could be safe. They weren't going to, like, you know, fly over a chair or a desk or something doing this. And they were able to, with their eyes closed, and we piloted the class with 6 students that semester. So they were able to organize each other perfectly well by height. And when they came to, a lot of them said, oh, I've stood next to you and I know I stare into your chest, so I'm shorter than you are. You know, there was that kind of thing. But they also used touch and were very appropriate with each other in using touch to be able to communicate with each other, because there were 2 that were really close in height. And so they took hands on each other's heads. And we then unpacked, after these exercises, we would unpack what happened, what we saw as instructors, and how it related to what we saw lawyers do. And then we would ask them to do the same, to relate the experience from their perspective to what they might do in a situation where they were unable to use vision and had to use either verbal or nonverbal communication to work with each other.
I like that. We have one more question and one more recommendation. I'll start with the recommendation. Kim Nair is recommending the book Mindset, The New Psychology of Success by Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck obviously is very well known. That's a great recommendation. And she's particularly recommending chapter 5. And then here's another question. It's my opinion that leadership requires self-reflection and self-directedness, which incoming law students seem to be lacking in larger numbers every year. What do you recommend for cultivating those fundamental skills of self-reflection and self-directedness?
I don't know, Beth, if you have something from your experience that you want to share. I want to make sure you get a word in edgewise so that I'm not monopolizing the conversation.
I know that in our basic leadership course that there are many opportunities to write short papers on self-reflection. And that spoke to the professor this week who teaches that, and I think that he has decided to add a couple of more opportunities for journaling and for writing short papers on self-reflection.
Yes, a lot of people know Buck Lewis on the call, and that's who Beth is referring to in his in our sort of flagship law course. Whereas as leaders, he offers reflection papers. He also offers several students the opportunity in class to share their self-reflections. And some of them are very moving and really sort of like that, and in a more powerful way than the exercise that we did with the ball in our first class. Enables the students to really pull together and understand each other better and work together as teams. Candace Reed, who also did a session last year for this group, she teaches the Dweck book and teaches part of mindset in her course. So I do highly recommend that. Her course is called Thriving as a Lawyer. She also uses reflection papers in that class. I've used them before in teaching non-leadership courses where I wanted to emphasize leadership. And I find they're a mixed bag. It's very difficult to give good instructions to students in a larger section class. The students sometimes behave in a way where they're checking the box and just performing a task. And so giving good instructions and being able to assess those self-reflections with students, I think it's non-trivial. So I love the question. I don't have the best answer yet, but still searching for it. I'm sure that others have tried some things that might work, but I do think it depends on class size, the nature of the class, what your learning objectives are of the class as to how you engage self-reflection and how you evaluate it or assess it to the extent that that's part of what you're trying to do.
Well, I think you also have to be very clear on what it is, what the objective is. Otherwise, as Joan says, people will just, I finished that assignment and mark it off. And I've seen in some course evaluations complaints that they just thought that was busy work. And to me, that said they didn't really understand what the purpose or the objective was.
You have really prompted
Agreed.
a lot of great recommendations here, by the way. It's amazing. I keep getting them. Here's another one. Kim Nair has another recommendation called Wiser, Getting Beyond Groupthink to Make Groups Smarter by Cass Sustain and Reed Hasty. And Ben Rigney is recommending Sally Jenkins' book,
Yeah.
The Right Call, What Sports Teaches
Yeah.
About Work and Life. And it has references to Pat Summitt, as a matter of fact. So these are great suggestions. As we near the end of our webinar today, I want to ask each of you if you would give us at least 3 takeaways. In other words, the 3 things that you would like everyone watching today to take away from this past hour about teaching leadership with non-techs. And Joan, I'll let you decide who goes first.
Oh, I think Beth, you should go first. I'm bound to say that some of the same things Beth says. We spent a lot of time together, so.
Okay.
But go ahead, and I'll try and find some new ones.
Well, the takeaways that I would come up with are really very simple and very basic. Number one is to keep an open mind and to be always on the lookout for books that have a connection to what you're teaching in class. There's one. Joan, you can do the other 2.
Oh, all right. So I thought we were going to do 3 each, but I have, because there are a lot of things I'd love for people to take away, but I'll start with get back to reading something other than law texts. If you're like me and you haven't done that, I found it hard to pick up a book and read it again. That was a non-law book after a number of years. And I just do recommend it. I think it has to do with the maintaining an open mind point that Beth just raised. And I think the other thing is don't be afraid to try and fail. I mean, with our teaching generally, that shows students leadership actually in some ways. If you're conveying things properly, you're telling them why you're selecting something unusual for them to read in class, why you're adding the 8 steps of change leadership to an advanced business associations course and making the students sort of pay attention to that for 10 or 15 minutes, hooking it into something maybe that a student has raised. For me, the failures are worth the successes, and maybe it's a mixed bag. One student gets a lot out of it and the other, 4 or 5 or 12 or 25 don't, but you've done something for that one student by trying, and you usually learn something yourself about your teaching, about your students. This is all part of the, lifelong learners philosophy that I think I've adopted and and am adapting to what my lifestyle was before that. Maybe it's just what's giving me joy now in my teaching. So I think those are my additional tips that I would add, and I'll leave the rest for a future conversation.
Well, Joan and Beth, you both were outstanding. We could have gone on easily another half hour, but we try to keep these to about 1 hour, so people will keep coming back. And we have a couple of other webinars scheduled, one in September, one in October, November. You might even be hearing about some in May or June. We'll let you know. And if I were you right now, I would cancel everything for the rest of the afternoon and either go to the library or a bookstore and start reading this afternoon. Don't waste any time. I know I'm going to try to do that because I've now been inspired. So thank you again, Joan and Beth, and all of you. Thank you for your interest in leadership. It's the one discipline that actually crosses all boundaries, and I would argue the single most important. Thanks for joining us again today. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.